I had a friend in college who once made hamburger helper and left out an essential ingredient. Yeah, you might think, what is there? There's the hamburger helper mix and the hamburger. She thought it helped so much you didn't even need the hamburger, but no, that's not optional when it comes to making that meal. That's essential. Well, what are the essential ingredients of Christianity? And I'm going to ask you, we said it's okay to talk during the sermon in this sense. You can't talk to each other. You can talk to me when I ask. What are essential ingredients to Christianity? Repentance. There you go. Faith. Christ. Yeah, there you go. No Christianity without Christ. Baptism. What was that? Okay. Obedience. A resurrection. There you go. All right, so you've got all of these things here, and you know, the one that I look at, and definitely it has to start with God and Christ, but certainly for Christianity, for me to be a part, for people to be a part, I've got to believe that, don't I? I've got to believe there is a God, that He sent His Son to die for us, and that's where things start. Certainly on my end, is where anything begins to happen. But that belief there, and we've said this a few times recently, belief is that mental part of it. I agree in my mind something is true. Well, faith then is where you take that belief and you act accordingly. Because I believe this is true, I do this. I act in this way. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's what we have been talking about in Mark. We've been going through, and you've been seeing the sermons that all have faith in the title. And a lot of them have fear as well. We saw the connection when Jesus and the disciples were crossing the Sea of Galilee and the storm came up, and they were afraid of drowning in the storm. And Jesus said, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And it shows us that idea that if they had had the faith, they wouldn't have been afraid of the storm. And we talked about the faith in what? Well, then it began to introduce an idea, because then it says they had great fear when they realized this man here, he can tell the storm to stop, and it stops. And we said that fear is the word, there's a different word for afraid than fear there, and it's not always translated consistently, but there's that one word, delos, that means afraid of the situation. And then there's the fear, the phobos, that can mean fear of the Lord, that healthy reverence, but also can be this idea of when faced with God and who He is, I would draw from the Lord and His will. And we saw that last week. You remember when Jesus cast out the demons from this man who lived in the cemetery. And the people of the town, it says they were greatly afraid, but it was that word phobos. And so they tell Jesus, they don't tell Him because they're afraid of Him. They beg Him, please depart from us. So they take that course of action. The disciples, when they develop this fear of the Lord, they draw closer to Him. The townspeople say, no, we're going to withdraw from you and please depart from us. Well, we're going to see this idea continued today. If you look at the main thought that's going to guide us here, if we're not faced with a fear choice, what to do out of this fear of either withdrawing from Jesus or not, we're not walking by faith. We're not fully walking by faith, because what we're going to see today is that walking by faith will bring us into a confrontation with this type of fear we've been seeing, this fear of the Lord, to either draw closer to Him or withdraw, to surrender to Him or not. And it happens when we truly walk by faith. And so that's an indicator. Am I walking by faith in the fullest sense of that word? And as Christians, we're called to do that. It's what we want to do. I think at times we think we are doing it, and maybe we're not. Again, this is the test. Am I facing these kind of fear choices? So let's look and see this passage that brings out this lesson here. Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. It says there, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, so He's on the Sea of Galilee. You remember that He crossed once after teaching the people all the parables. He crossed over, and that's where He was on the west side with the Gentiles and the demoniac. He cast out the demons. Well, now He's come back here. A great crowd gathered about Him, and He was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Can you lay your hands on her so she may be made well and live? Now, it seems a ruler of the synagogue was more of an administrative position. He wasn't a religious figure. He was someone who kept up the synagogue in that town, which we don't know for sure. Seems like it might be Capernaum. But he comes and he falls at Jesus' feet. He's not worshiping Jesus. Again, they don't realize he's God in the flesh at this point. But he's begging him. Look what the situation is. His daughter is at the point of death. He's certainly heard about Jesus. Everyone's heard about Jesus. And he believes that Jesus can heal his daughter. He says that. Please just come and lay your hands on her so she may be made well and live. And so this is faith. He not only believes it in his mind, but he has come to Jesus. He's fallen down at his feet. He's begging him, please come. He's done what that belief should lead to. He's showing faith here. Well, then it says Jesus went with him in verse 24, but on the way, there's an interruption of sorts, at least certainly from Jairus' perspective, as they're moving toward his house and his daughter. It says a great crowd followed him and thronged about him, and that makes sense there. That's the way he always was, but it's going to set up something else that happens. Verse 25, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. So she has this physical issue, this physical ailment. She's had it for 12 years. It says in verse 26, she had suffered much under many physicians. We don't know what their, attempted remedies were, but they were not easy. They were difficult. She had spent all she had, so that part has come into play, and she's no better, but rather grew worse. So just think about this woman. Think about if you've ever suffered from any ailment, 12 years. You've tried all this. The remedies have, maybe been worse than the symptoms themselves. She spent all she's had. And then also understand that in the Jewish society, not only was this the physical ailment, but the bleeding would make her unclean. And to touch anyone else would make them unclean. So this would isolate her from people. This would isolate her spiritually. And so that's what she was also going through. This woman was desperate in every way you can imagine. Well, verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. Now, we don't see prior to this specifically that Jesus healed that way, but it seems like it. In Mark 3:10, it says he had healed many so that all who had diseases pressed around to touch him. And we see it then later, certainly in chapter 6, verse 56, that's what people are doing intentionally. And so this woman has heard about it, and she believes as well. And once again, we talk about, people want to say faith is the opposite of reason. That is the dumbest thing ever. Faith is absolutely based on reason. You see both of these. They had heard about Jesus. They had heard the firsthand reports. They'd heard the evidence and said, it makes total sense. It's totally reasonable to believe Jesus, Jairus in his case, can heal my daughter at the point of death. This woman, I can just touch him and be healed. Made total sense. They didn't walk up to anyone else and say, hey, will you heal my daughter? Hey, I'm going to touch you and try to get well. That would have been foolishness. That would have been the opposite of reason, but they had reason. Biblical faith has reason. And realize whatever position you have about God and Jesus, it's a matter of faith. You don't know for absolutely certain. You are basing your decision on the evidence. Which position has more evidence? Well, they both thought it makes sense. It is reasonable to not only believe in Jesus, but to act on it, to do it. Well, then verse 29, and immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Now, you see this word that we had seen very often at the beginning of Mark. Haven't seen it as much during the parables and so, but this immediately. This decisive action. Mark is writing to these Roman-oriented readers who are men of action, people of action. And so immediately things happen. You see that over. It's going to be 4 times in this passage. Well, Jesus asked this question, who touched my garments? In verse 31, his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, right, Jesus? All these people? And yet you say, who touched me? And this would be like some major event, football game. Everybody's waiting to get into the stands. And you're like, who touched me? Well, everyone's touching you. There's people everywhere. All kinds of people had touched him. But he knew something had happened. He looked around, verse 32, to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Fear and trembling. Why? Well, one, just to be put on the spot like that, to be, okay, he knew. I had hoped I had hoped he wouldn't find out. And part of that probably was the bleeding issue and the spiritual ramification of that, the religious, the uncleanness. I've intentionally touched him, this religious leader, made him unclean. But it says she tells him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Now, she'd already been healed. That seems more just to let, her know for sure. Maybe those around know for sure. Everything has happened. Everything has been done because of her faith. So she had it as well. She believed in Jesus. She acted in accordance with that belief and seeking him out, working through the crowd, touching him. And what's interesting, though, is then you see her faith led to a fear moment. In fear and trembling, she fell down before him. Well, go on then, verse 35. While he was still speaking to her, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And so once again, he had believed up to the certain point. He knew. He came to Jesus. Jesus, my daughter's at the point of death. But I believe, and I'm acting out of faith, that if you come and lay your hands on her, you can touch her. Well, this had raised the bar. We haven't seen Jesus raise anyone from the dead yet. And we don't know. Certainly the people who are coming to him are saying, don't bother him. There's no point now. She's past the point of no return. The man apparently had some temptation to fear in that same way. And Jesus says, do not fear, only believe. Continue to believe in me, and the implication to do what that leads to continue with this. And so you see here that his faith led to a fear moment. Don't fear, only believe. And he does that. Verse 37, it says, Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John. This is the first of 3 times that he takes that inner circle with him. John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion. People weeping and wailing loudly, and it's quite possible in that day and age that these weren't just family members and friends and neighbors, these were professional mourners. It was so important to have this type of external display of people clapping and wailing. There would be people, that was their job. They're mourners professionally. I think might know some people who seem like professional mourners in some sense today. They're always mourning about something in one sense or the other. Well, this was a little different. They get paid to be brought in. Well, it says there in verse 39, when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Now, did Jesus know the child was dead? Yes, but from his perspective, he also knew what was going to happen. And so she might as well have just been asleep. With the power he had, it's not going to take any more for him than someone to just wake her up on a normal day. And so he says that there. And well, they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumai, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Talitha Kumai was in Aramaic, and that was probably the language they spoke. It's a derivative of Hebrew. Hebrew had morphed into Aramaic, and so you can see a lot of the similarities, but that's what they would speak. And it seems like, why did Mark include this? It's sort of the eyewitness detail, and he wasn't there, but you remember he got his gospel, most of the information from Peter. And Peter was there. He was one of the ones in that room, and we know there weren't many there. And so it adds that credibility there to the reason for faith. And it means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And that's important too, because Jesus isn't praying to God to bring her back to life. Any faithful person, throughout the Bible, there are people who did that. But Jesus, it's just like the storm. He rebuked the storm. He said, peace, be still. And you see, it's not him appealing to God's power. It is him with this power and authority that he's been granted there. And then verse 42, immediately the little girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. He's not ready for this to get out. Again, if people hear, they've already heard so much about him, and we've seen all the crowds that come for healing. Well, now this would even more further distract from, at this point, his focus on, I want to teach the people the truth. I want to tell them the truth about the kingdom of heaven. But he also wants them to know, again, evidence for the future. When the disciples make this claim that he's the Son of God, here's some of that evidence. Here's the reason to believe that. Well, you look through this and you definitely see this theme of faith. And, we should realize that walking by faith is essential to the Christian life. And you look how I worded that there. It's the essence of. We pronounce it essential. It's the essence of. What again is the essence of Christianity? Well, a lot of people, probably the first thing that comes to mind is they're going to say obedience. Probably close after that will be belief and maybe faith, but I don't know that we always understand the difference between belief and faith. That I have faith that there's a God. I have faith. Well, that's really the belief in the sense of I believe the fact there's a God. I believe Jesus is the Son, rose from the dead. Faith is when we act on that, and it's the foundation for our obedience a lot of times. Not all of it, but I guess maybe it's not always as prevalent as some sorts. You got up this morning to come here. Well, it's because I have faith. It's the best thing to do as a believer in God. But sometimes we're faced with big things. Do I tell the truth knowing it could get me in trouble with my job, with another person? And God says to do it. I don't really want to face the consequences, but I obey God. Why? Because I have faith in Him that His way is best. Not faith that it's going to work out perfectly or easily, but faith in God. And so it's the foundation, certainly, for obedience. And then faith also, as I've said, it's that completion of belief. To just believe something in our mind and not act in accordance with that makes no sense at all. It'd be like you coming across a check made out to you for $1 million. Oh, yeah, I believe it's totally legit. The person, he's got it, he wants me to have it, and then never cashing the check. That would make no sense. Well, it makes no sense to believe things and not act in accordance. That's why James says faith was completed by his works. Talking about Abraham being willing to sacrifice Isaac, he believed in God, that God was capable of doing things. Well, that belief, it became completed faith when he did something that was in accordance with it, that fit that made sense. Well, we need to realize as Christians there that this faith, again, not just the belief that there is a God and Jesus is the Son. This faith is part of the DNA of our Christian life. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." And you notice I put those dashes in that's there in the text. They're there because this is a parenthetical. This is a side thought. Paul does not go into some discussion. He doesn't try to persuade people that as Christians we walk by faith, not by sight. It should be just as obvious that fishes breathe underwater. No one has to okay, I'm going to give you 15 reasons so you'll know fishes breathe underwater. No, I just look at it. I see it. I know it. He's like, that should be so obvious to us as Christians. We walk by faith, not by sight. It is part of our DNA. It's who we are. It's at least who we should be. Well, as we look at this for ourselves, what do we get out of this? What do we take with us? Well, this faith is the DNA of our lives as Christians that should be. It's made up of reliance on God and surrender to Him. I rely upon God. I mean, are there things I need to do at times? Yes, but ultimately I realize I'm relying on Him. And I surrender to Him. Why? Because He's God and I'm not, as we saw in Sunday school. It makes no sense to not do both of those. To rely on me when I'm in a relationship with God. To not surrender when I'm in a relationship with God. We saw last week, that's why the townspeople didn't want Him there. It was obvious to them, He's above us, we're here. He's got all this power, He could cast out these demons. If He's going to stay, we need to surrender. We don't want to surrender. Please leave, Jesus. There's people today. I don't want to surrender to Jesus, so I'm not going to enter into this faith relationship with Him. But that needs to be part of where it starts. And that means that as we are Christians, if we made that decision, There need to be some goals in our lives as Christians that require God and His power, that require me to rely on Him and surrender to Him for the results. Now, once again, you've got this tough thing that I can't just set out and say, okay, God, I'm going to come up with this goal and now you need to do it. But God has certainly led us, go into all the world and make disciples. You know, I remember reading a story in a Mark Batterson book about prayer, and he talked about a church up in Canada several years ago when the World's Fair was coming there, and they realized we're going to have all these people around us. We have such an opportunity to impact them for Christ, to try to make disciples. And it was a small church, had very low budget, but they're like, to do this is going to take a lot of activity and efforts and resources, way more than our normal budget. But the opportunities here, God has said to do what we can to make disciples, we're going to trust. And they did trust, and God provided everything they needed. And he talked about churches that don't set their budget based on, well, last year we had this, let's maybe trust God will help us grow a little bit more, or we lost this family, and so we need, that's sight. They base their budget on, wow, here's this new opportunity, here's a new apartment car, here's this or that. It's going to take a lot of money to do this. All right, God wants us to do it, let's trust Him to do it. If we don't have some goals like that are in line with God's will, and this takes some getting into the Word and seeing situations and talking to other Christians, that whole growth triangle. But if I don't have something in my life that requires me to rely on God, I'm missing a key part of the point of the Christian life. If I think the Christian life is just, well, I don't do this and don't do this, and I do this and do this, now, we've said before, that's like Christianity 101. That's the basics. God says, okay, yeah, of course. Here's where I want you to get to. I want you to rely on me providing for you and blessing you, that relationship circle, so it brings glory to me. That needs to be a part of our Christian life. And I think if we do that, though, there's always going to be that element of, I'm a little afraid. What if this doesn't work out? What if I commit to this and it doesn't happen? Good. That should be there. Faith by nature brings that. And that's what we see. Choosing to walk by faith brings another challenge, brings another choice. Two great examples here of walking by faith. And look, both of them, because of that choice, they face a fear challenge. Look at verse 32 in the woman. Jesus looked around to see who had done it, who had touched him intentionally to be healed. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And that fear there, remember I said there's the two Greek words? This is that phobos fear, the fear of the Lord fear. It's the choice, all right? He's God. He's awesome. He's majestic. Am I going to surrender in reverence, or am I going to withdraw? Verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any longer? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Same word. That fear of the Lord. Do not fear, do not withdraw from me because of this. Only believe. Have faith, rely, surrender to me. When we take a step of faith, when we walk by faith as God intends, that is not going to make things smooth and easy most of the time. Matter of fact, most of the time when you take a step of faith, you know what's going to happen? Things are going to get more difficult. The stakes are going to get raised. You know, you look at this man here. His daughter was at the point of death. He came to Jesus. He believed. He acted in faith. He came to Jesus. And what happened? His daughter died. You know this that God was orchestrating all of this. You know God the Father could have kept the girl alive. You know that this interruption, what seemed like that from an earthly perspective, it could have been saved. Who knows how close they were to his house. He could have got there before she died. That's not what God wanted to happen. Maybe it's not what Satan wanted to happen. You know, sometimes we don't know. Here's the thing. When we do walk by faith, that gets Satan's attention. Especially nowadays, because I think so few people are doing it. So he does, he's not like, well, everywhere, everyone's doing it. Who do I focus on? No, well, there's only a few. That's pretty easy. We get Satan's attention. And Satan will try to then undermine that choice. You really have that much faith? Let's see how much. Or God will also allow us to be tested. James talks about the testing of your faith, the refining of your faith produces perseverance, a persevering faith, and you can end up mature and complete where God wants us to be. And so, we don't even know. I don't think we could ever look and say, well, that was Satan doing this, that was God doing this, that was God allowing Satan to do this. A little bit like Job. Job didn't know what was going on. Well, we don't know either, but it will happen, I guarantee you. When you take a step of faith truly and you rely on God, one way or the other, expect something to happen. The stakes get raised. It becomes more difficult. I was talking to some friends in Arizona, and they're self-employed, have a web development business, and they said, wow, the finances have really been tough. We lost a customer that had been with us for a long time and all this. And my friend said, that's stinking Dave Ramsey. Like, what? Dave Ramsey is a Christian financial advisor. They had started taking his course. They were committing to living by his disciplined financial principles. And he saw this as we're being tested. I agree. He said it tongue in cheek, but he realized, all right, I'm being tested. Am I really going to live these out when things get harder? A lot of you saw this week that I posted on Tuesday on Facebook. What did we do before Facebook? We had to come to church and, just ask, from the very beginning instead of, what'd you do on Tuesday? I know what you did. How'd it go, I guess. But I took off Tuesday. I mentioned the fact, went to Skyline Chili, went and saw a movie. And so people were asking me, Tuesday was great. Boy, it went downhill from there. It went really downhill from there. And, it got to the point that Thursday, one of the roughest days I can ever remember. And part of that was the fact that not only was, just different things happened and struggling. And sometimes you look back, I can't even put my finger on it. But I was at the point, I remember, Lisa was going to be home, my daughter wasn't. And I was going to, Lisa, what do you want to do tonight? Up to and including jumping off a cliff. I'm with you. Oh, we called my daughter that night, who had been doing better last Saturday, I mentioned. They're changing her medicine and that stuff, depression meds. If you've ever experienced that firsthand or secondhand, that can just be brutal, the change. That had her affected physically. Just the situation was the same. She was so down, and she's been down before, but she just really seemed hopeless. And she talked about that. She says, sometimes I wish I could just go to sleep, not wake up. And she's been there. That's why, if you've all seen the tattoo, it's suicide awareness. That's why we've got them, our whole family. And my wife, when we were on the phone, she says, I felt that way a little bit today. And that's where I told him I did too. And so it's not me. It's okay, wow, my wife's struggling, my daughter's struggling. Oh, Tuesday seemed like so far away at that point. And just to realize that will happen. Matter of fact, as I looked at that, I wondered, it's okay, why? I've had some really tough times. I remember when I started the church. I remember when I, was preparing, looking intently. I remember getting ready for that sermon a few weeks ago about just, wow, are we even doing church right? And then this, what's the point this week? And I realized, I had been trying to really walk by faith, to realize it's not just the things I do, it's trusting God for the results. I'll tell you the thing that I've got in the trap of is I advertise for my online ministry on Facebook. I'm just always looking, all right, how many people do I get now? How many people? No, I can't. I'm doing the right things, but not the right way. We talked about that in Sunday school. I've got to do it by faith. To have a ministry that's meant to promote faith and not be faithful in the way you do it, or full of faith, I can't do that. And I think that's the choice I was being faced with. Steve, all right, you going to withdraw from that, or are you going to surrender to me? And that's the essence of this fear, this phobos. It's withdrawal or surrender, whatever form that takes. And we don't know. I mentioned last week that, sometimes our surrender is just a matter of, all right, God, I could choose to do something I know you don't want me to. I'm not going to. When I used to, my daughter would, get all angry or upset, and I knew, okay, I can diffuse this, or I can assert my dominance as dad. Well, that hasn't worked well. Let's be wise as dad and not exasperate my child. But there's times where I didn't surrender to that. I have the choice. There's other times where I'm in a situation and I can't change it. Financial. It's, okay, I got this bill. I don't know how it's going to be paid. I need to surrender to God. No, I don't want to. And the money automatically shows up. Now, the money's not there. My surrender takes the form of, am I going to worry about it? or am I going to trust God? That's what the surrender is. And so your faith, whatever it is, the same with the withdrawing, whatever form that takes. As I was there on Thursday and things were so, there's this part like, God, I just don't want to do anything. I just want to withdraw from, I want to get back to maybe the normal Christian life. Can I be one of those ones Satan doesn't notice? Like, I won't do anything bad, but boy, I'm tired of trying to really live by this faith because it's gaining a lot of attention I'd rather not have. And you get that thought, am I going to withdraw like that or am I going to stay there? That's what we're going to be faced with. If we step out on faith, I guarantee you it's going to make life more difficult. Like, well, okay, you sure we want to do that then? Well, we do, but in between that, before we say why we should do it, the big thing is be ready, okay? What would be worse? What's the Boy Scouts motto? Be prepared. What's worse? I'm not prepared for something. I think, and even what is worse is I'm prepared for the opposite. Many Christians today, I think if they heard, okay, step out in faith and obey God, what do they think is going to happen? Well, everything's going to go great. I obeyed God. I stepped out on faith. Especially when you got this whole element of, the Christian world saying, name it and claim it. You have true faith. You'll guarantee get whatever you want. I'm like, well, I had faith and things didn't turn out well. What happened? Well, we need to be ready and realize when I have faith, it's not going to make things easier. Definitely not right away. And so I've got to be ready for that. I've got to expect it and know how to face it. And how do I face that? And I tell you, the thing I've seen, and again, the providence of God that has helped me more than anything these last couple weeks is a psalm we looked at a few weeks ago. Psalm 42 and 43, and they go together. And they give two steps. And David not David, the sons of Korah there, are facing something. We don't know exactly what. And they say, why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you troubled within me? And it's not like they don't remember why. They're like, why am I letting this get to me for so long? I know it hit me at first, but don't stay there. And he gives two steps. So the first one's in Psalm 42:6. He says, my soul is downcast within me, therefore I will remember you. And he's talking to God. In other words, things are difficult. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to remember God, who you are and what you've done in my life, what you've done in the lives of others. And that needs to be our response. When we're facing this difficulty, I need to remember, God, you have done so much. I've seen it in your word. I've heard it in others. And boy, have I seen it in my life. I know you're still with me, even though I can't feel it. I know this is best, even though I don't see it at the moment. I remember you. And it's why I say, if you're a Christian, you need to have some type of journal. Even if it's not every day, just have a big event journal. All right, this thing is going on, it's difficult, write it down. This is how it resolved, okay. That you can flip back and look at or search on your computer, whatever it is. That's so beneficial to do. And then the other thing that comes up in this psalm together, these two that go together, is Psalm 43:3. Says, send out your light and your truth, talking to God, let them lead me, let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. In other words, God, I'm not feeling your presence. Please send your light and truth to help me see and feel your presence again and more. That's what I want, God. And maybe that form is, God, I've been trying to remember. That's the first thing I remember. God, help me remember. If there's something I've forgotten, or God, even something totally different and new, show me your light, your truth. And of course, the main way that comes is from His Word. God, bring me into contact. Help the sermon this week to be something I need. Help me to come across it in my Bible reading, whatever it is. God, help me to look at situations and see what you've done. Help a friend to come and show up and say the right thing at the right time. Whatever it is, God, please send your light, your truth. Help me through this difficult time. And then what I would say is when you are ready like that, be ready for your readiness to be tested. Because that's what got me through, I think it was like Wednesday or maybe early Thursday morning. It was starting to hit and I said, God, you know what I'm going to do? That Psalm 42:43. I remember what you've done. Thank you. Help me see even more clear. Thank you. And then the bottom just fell out. I'm like, okay, God's like, are you really going to do this Psalm 42:43 stuff? Let's see. Or Satan is like, are you going to stick through this? I don't know what it was, but boy, after I remembered to do this, it got even harder. And so you might be thinking, wow, you sure we want this? Well, the last thing is blessings do come when we surrender. We saw this last week. I can't help but thinking of those people when the demoniac was healed. There's Jesus. They know he has this power to cast out demons. They know he has supernatural power to help. And what do they say? Please leave. Please leave. What did they miss out on? I mean, if not, healing people, doing things. I don't know where the salvation would have led at that point, but certainly just the physical things. But the man surrenders to Jesus. He wants to go with him. Jesus says no. He's like, okay. Jesus says, stay and tell what has happened. And he told them, says the people marveled at it. He was a blessing to them. He no doubt prepared the soil for when the full message came later. He was blessed by his surrender. Well, think about this woman here. She was blessed. She'd already been healed, but just to be able then to come back and face her fear and, Jesus, I was the one, and tell him everything. Surrender like that and get to hear peace. Don't worry about it. Your faith has made you well. You're healed. She knows for sure. It's been done. And just imagine, you have to figure this woman, it's not long after Jesus dies, is resurrected, the message spreads, and she knows, wow, this person wasn't just a guy. She comes to realize this is the Son of God. I was there. He talked to me. And then Jairus, think about him. His surrender. What if he'd said no? What if, like, Jesus, will you come heal my daughter because she's at the point of death? And then he hears she's dead, and Jesus says, don't fear, just believe. He's like, no, what's the point? Go ahead, Jesus. His daughter would have been dead. And so we look at us, and we need to think about this. If I surrender, things will be better. Things that were good will be even more full, like this woman. There'll be an added dimension to it. And like Jairus, if I surrender, I'll experience something above and beyond what I even thought was possible. Or I can miss out. There's no situation where surrender isn't easier, but it's better. It's better. I get to experience God, this relationship He wants to have with me. I get to know Him in a deeper, fuller way. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be maybe the most difficult time of your life. But you look back and say, I'm glad I did it. This week was so difficult at the end, but I wouldn't trade it. I've seen even more now who God is and what He can do. I've seen that He can get me through those difficult times. I wouldn't trade it for me. I wouldn't trade it as a witness for others to bolster your courage. He can do it. Well, I always say there's a root problem, and this one really struck me. I thought it was interesting, and here's what it is. We think, as Christians, I think, sometimes we think our belief in God and Jesus is faith. We miss that distinction between I believe there is a God, I believe Jesus is His Son, died for sins, and faith. I act in accordance with it. And, especially when we start to add in some good things. Well, I'm a believer, and I do good things. I thought about these people who came and told Jairus the message. Your daughter's dead, why bother the teacher any longer? These weren't like thieves and scoundrels. Every indication, these were friends, these were religious people. They went to synagogue on Saturday, they prayed, they did all this stuff, but they're faced with this and they say, don't bother Jesus, no one can do this, no one can bring her back from the dead. And I thought about us, that sometimes we think, I believe these things, I must be living by faith, and I don't think that's the case. And just one more thing came to mind, and I'm going to share it here. James 2:17, or 2:14. The key to overcoming is to know the difference between belief and faith. And I think there's a verse here that we get a little confused by. James 2 talks about this idea of belief versus faith. You remember that? He's talking about, faith without works is dead, and he's not even saying it's not even faith if it doesn't have works. And he distinguishes, and here's another thing I need to mention. The word in Greek, it's the same word for belief and faith. I'm making the distinction here. It's not in the Greek, and the point is it shouldn't have been. Belief and faith, it should be. If I believe, I'm acting in accordance with it. But it is interesting in the Bible, whenever the noun is there, that noun for belief or faith, it's almost always translated faith. And James seems to make a distinction. He uses the verb for believe, and there is no verb for faith, faithing, faithed. It's just a noun. So he uses the verb believe to distinguish between the fuller sense of the noun faith. That's why he says even the demons, he doesn't say they have faith, he says they believe. Well, faith without works is dead. It's just believing. So he's making that distinction, and he gives this illustration in chapter 2. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled, without giving them things needed for the body, what good is it? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And here's what I say. I think we look at that, and because James is doing this illustration of, if someone's at your door and they don't have enough clothes for the weather and they don't have any food, and you say, hey, go in peace, be warm and filled, and don't do anything, what good is it? And then he says the same thing, faith without works. And we think, okay, so the works that need to accompany my faith are these good deed type things. I do the good thing for that person at the door. Do I? Yes, but that's not all he's talking about. That was his illustration. To say I'm helping them and not giving them the food and the clothing, you're not really helping. Well, to say I have faith without doing what that faith entails, what does that entail? Whatever I'm faced with. Yeah, if it's a person there at the door, then hopefully I got enough faith, even if I wasn't sure of the food myself. Oh, I'm about out of food myself. I'll have faith and trust God. But if it's something different, again, if I'm faced with a choice at work, if I'm faced with a choice in my relationship, I hear people all the time, Christians included, I remember once, and I had one other person came up recently, a person who was going to divorce their spouse because their spouse wasn't spiritual enough. Like, you're going to disobey God because your spouse isn't spiritual enough. That's interesting. No, faith in that situation calls for you to do what God says, and you stay there. Faith in the situation, again, I'm pursuing this ministry. Oh, man, it was tough. There's a part of me that said, why don't you just back off? No, I'm not going to. I don't know what it is. There's so many, but that's what it is. Because I believe there's a God. Jesus is His Son, died for me. He's with me. He wants me to live this life of making disciples and relying on Him. All right, what's that look like in this situation I'm faced with, in this situation, in this situation? What's it look like there? And it's not just, I show up on Sunday. Yeah, that's the situation I'm faced with every Sunday morning. But what am I faced with the rest of the time? That's what I do. Whatever is called for, I do it. And I think we've narrowed it down to, I have faith. Why? Because I do some good things. That's not all it is. Well, what do we need to do now? How do we take us with this? In light of this, examine. Ask yourself, how much do I have faith versus only belief? Believe most of us here believe there's a God, Jesus' Son, and died for sins. All right, but how much faith do I have? How much, when I'm faced with a situation, I act, if I really believe there's a God, He's in control, He loves me, I would do this. And that's what I do. That's what it means. And then I tell you what, go over and above. Ask God to give you a faith adventure, a faith challenge. God, I don't want to just be ready for it. Give me one. I want to live this life. I want to experience this life the way it's supposed to be. I want to experience you in this relationship to its fullest. And that comes when I walk by true faith. So God, give it to me. Realize where I am and give me something I can handle. But enough to challenge me, because if I can handle it too easy, that's not faith. But be willing to say that. Are you willing to say that to God? God, give me a faith adventure. I'm tempted to ask people to raise your hands. I won't do that. But here's where you're going to do, whether you do it up in the air or not, we're at our time of invitation and decision. And so you're deciding right now, I'm going to do that. I'm going to say, God, give me a faith adventure, or I'm not. And as always, the faith adventure starts with becoming a Christian and realizing that's what I'm signing up for. It's not just to be forgiven and go to heaven. I'm saying, Jesus, I commit to blank. I commit to a blank sheet, and I'm signing my name. Whatever you want from me, that's what I'm going to do. Whatever it is. I don't know what it is. So as we stand and sing our hymn of invitation, again, that's the decision all of us need to make. Will I commit to whatever faith challenge God puts before me?